Hello, my name is Stewart Carroll and welcome to Drone Film Guide, the channel where we learn to fly like filmmakers. Now, today we are talking about the one thing that if you're not doing it quite right, it is going to transform your footage. Sounds dead exciting, must be some really cool color grading preset or something like that. Well, I'm afraid not. We are going back to basic principles of cinematography. We are talking about exposure and you have to get it right every single time. And this little guy is going to help us explain how to make sure that every single time you have perfect exposure and professional footage. So before we get into it, we have a great loyal following on this channel and many of you have been saying, could you do longer tutorials? The YouTube kind of forces you to do these super punchy tutorials, top 5, this, that, the next thing, and it's great and we will continue to do it, but I quite like to talk and sometimes I could talk for hours on subjects and I don't think YouTube is the platform for that. So we have launched the Drone Film Guide Club on our website and we would encourage you to join our club by clicking on the link below and signing up on our website, and as and when we have our more in-depth detailed content available, you will be notified and the first to know. So go ahead and sign up below. Right, let's crack on. Getting correct exposure is a black and white issue. There's no middle ground here, there's no subjectivity involved. You have to get it right in camera. The only way to do that realistically with the equipment that we have is to use the histogram. Go into your settings, switch on the histogram, and you'll see this little chart. Maybe you've seen it before, maybe you switched it off because you didn't know what it was. Maybe you've heard about it but haven't used it. You have to use it. We'll get into some examples in a minute just to show you exactly what the histogram means and how you can interpret it when you're outside filming. But let's just understand for a quick second why it is so important. Let's cut to the chase here. We are talking about blown out highlights for drone cinematography. By highlights, we're talking about the whites in the image, and by blown out, we're talking about when the exposure is cranked up so much that you can't see any detail left in it. And the reason this comes up so many times is because as drone pilots, we're faced with clouds, which are white. Often we're filming something with snow in it, so maybe a snowy scene or the snow at the top of mountains, which is white. Let's say those of you that live in hot, fancy, beachy places that we're dead jealous of, the froth on the tops of the waves is white. And in our case, maybe some of you as well, we do lots of weddings. We do a lot of wedding drone cinematography, and the wedding dresses are white. You have to get it right, and you can't just have this blob of blown out kind of fluorescent white in your image. It looks completely unprofessional. Fine, if for whatever reason you're going to tell me you want to do it stylistically afterwards in post-production, go ahead. But don't bake it onto your memory card there and then because you're going to have no flexibility afterwards. The other massive issue we have is when you're standing out there looking at your iPad or your phone, you don't know how bright that phone is or how bright the iPad is, and the bigger issue is the way the light hits the screen. Often you've got a lot of reflection, so you can't really see what's going on the screen very well. It's really quite hard. The only way you can get past that is to look at the histogram, switch it on and use the histogram. Now, let's look at some examples so you really understand what that little graph is showing you. So here's a shot we set up inside with the Phantom 4 to help demonstrate this example. Lots of white in the shot, and as you can see everything looks about right. Exposure looks pretty good on visual inspection, and in fact when you bring up the histogram it confirms that. On the far left we have black and on the far right we have white. Everything else is in between, and as you can see on the little histogram there, everything is in between in this shot. We don't have any extreme blacks or whites. It's a nice balanced exposure. If we crank up the exposure a bit though, look how the thing shifts to the right. Everything in that histogram shifts to the right. You can see that the image has gone quite white there. Now it's still within the tolerances here. We don't have any blown out highlights as you'll see in a second in the next example, but I did prefer the previous one. It'd be easier to color grade. This is what we want to avoid though. Look at the big spike on the far right of the histogram. This is where you know you've got a problem, and as you can see there we have this horrible kind of fluorescent-y white. It's blown out, there's no detail there, and in post-production there'd be no ability to recover that detail either. Now the real issue is that whilst it's really obvious here sitting at the computer, when you're outside with the glare on the screen, you might not be able to tell that that's the shot that you've got, and you're going to have to rely on the histogram because it is a visual depiction of the exposure. You must use the histogram. So let's look at a more extreme example here. We've got two colours basically, black and white and some grey. This is filmed on a Panasonic GH4, so let's take a look at how the histogram depicts this image. Here you can see on the back of the camera the black at the far left, which we told you about before, and Teddy is the little mound on the right hand side closer to white. We've got some white, some shades of grey, and in the middle we've got the grey. Let's get rid of the man and see what we've got left. Here you can see the black that we were talking about. No sign of any of those lighter, whiter colours on the far right of the histogram. Here's another depiction of what's going on. On the left we have underexposed, in the middle we have correct exposure, and on the right we have overexposed. And just look at how the histogram shifts from the left to the right as the exposure is going up and up on those highlights. So let's get into this in a bit more detail. You can bring up your histogram in editing software, and in this case we're using Final Cut 10 for those of you who are going to ask. And no, your interface probably doesn't look like this because we've set it up just for this example. Now look at this solid black here. It has 0 value on the histogram. As we told you, black is 0. Let's jump across to white. White, 100. See, I wasn't lying to you. 0 and 100. That's when you isolate out those elements, isolate those colours. And grey here, somewhere in between, 50. Now that grey value can span anywhere between 0 and 100 depending on how dark this is. So every colour sits in here, and as you saw in the example with the teddy, we don't want these big blown out spikes here because they just look ugly on the whites. When you combine the 3 colours, you can see a very basic histogram with only 3 colours, black, grey and white. So that is the simplest form of what we're looking at. Let's take it to a real world example. Here you have 0, 100, it's a pretty nice demonstration or a pretty nice shot of a church, and we have all the colours in between. But how on earth do we know what we're looking at here? This just looks like a mess. Now at the end of the day, in the simplest possible sense, this is what you want to see, but let's dig into it in a little bit more detail and let's isolate the sky for a second and see where that sits on the histogram. This is the shot of the church again, but zoomed in a lot just to isolate the sky, and you can see that the blue sits here, about 50 or so. This shade of blue, and you can kind of guess that because you know it's not black, you know it's not white, it's somewhere in between. It's a very kind of mid-tone colour, and there is blue, 50. Let's go back to the original shot. Look at this, 50. So we know that this section here on this shot is the sky. Let's look at the grass. Grass sits about 40, it's a bit darker than the sky. And again, if we look here, we see we've got this big spike at about 40, and that's because we have lots of green in this shot. And we know what we're looking at now. Sky's here, grass is here. How cool is that? We know that white is 100, clouds are white. Now in this shot, because we have good exposure on the clouds, we've got a range of light greys all the way from about 75 to 100, and we know that that is the cloud. If we go back to the original shot, here we go. There's your clouds there. I'm going to show you very quickly what happens when we play around with the exposure, just to really emphasize this point. Let's take the highlights here and zoom them up. Look at that. That's exactly what I was talking about and exactly what we want to avoid. There you go. There's your highlights. We do not want that. So let's just bring that down a bit more slowly this time. You see that spike? See the way the detail in the clouds is being recovered as I play with that slider? As I bring that back and start creeping that down so we're back towards 100, there we go. All the detail is back in the clouds. So there you have it. I don't want to see any more blown out clouds from you guys. I don't want to see any more blown out snow-covered mountains or froth on the tops of waves. It just doesn't look professional. Get it right in camera and it'll make your life so much easier when you're doing the post-production and setting up your nice shots, especially if you're going to try and blend it with some ground camera footage, some regular footage. Really hard to do if you've got this kind of wacky blown out drone stuff. Don't forget what we were saying at the start there about Drone Film Guide Club. Join our club. We're going to have lots more interesting, more in-depth tutorials on that for those of you that really want to get into this and want to learn more. Obviously, we'll stick on YouTube. Loads more content coming on YouTube. So we'll see you next time at Drone Film Guide.